Okay. So most of you are here. I think we're only missing Joseph. So maybe he can join in a few minutes. So we'll get started. So today we are starting with our last market structure, which is oligopoly. Okay. So far, we've discussed perfect competition, then we discussed monopoly. Lastly, we discussed monopolistic competition, and today is oligopoly. So, some characteristics of oligopoly. So, there are a small number of large producers in oligopoly. Okay. So as you can see, this is different than all of the other market structures that we looked into. With perfect competition, there were infinitely many producers, farms in the market, and they were all relatively very small compared to the entire market. And we saw something similar with monopolistic competition. They had it had a large number of farms that were relatively small compared to the market. And monopoly, of course, as you remember, it's only one farm, so of course it's one gigantic farm. So but in any case, with oligopoly, the industry tends to be top heavy. So that is what we mean when we say that there are a few large producers, because these top these few large farms, they're gonna tend to control or account for most of the production and also sales in the industry. Okay, so some oligopolies in some oligopoly industries, the 10 largest farms will often account for over 75% of total sales in the industry. And in some industries, it will be like the three to four largest farms account for over 95% of the sales in the industry. Okay. Um, and then so it doesn't really it's not so much about how many farms there are in the market or in the industry. It's about what defines, or what characterizes an oligopoly is if you have a few farms that sort of dominate the industry. So it's not going to be one, but it's definitely going to be like two, three, four, or eight or 10, right? That tends to account for most of the activities that happen in the market. Okay. And the product that these oligopolies, that the type of product that oligopolies sell, can be either differentiated or standard. So standard, meaning like identical, or they can be somewhat differentiated. So identical product oligopolies, they tend to uh, process raw materials or intermediate goods that are basically used as inputs by other industries. So if you take a look at an example of standardized products, or an industry, an oligopoly industry that sells standardized product, would be crude oil, steel, aluminum, petroleum, right? So we don't necessarily, so these things, right, crude oil, steel, aluminum, we don't use them as consumer goods. They're not consumer goods, right? They are rather used as inputs to make something else, right? So that would be an oligopoly that is making an identical product. So in most cases, it's going to be processing raw materials for to be used as inputs in making other consumer goods. And then if they're selling a differentiated product, those are mostly going to be consumer goods, that satisfy the wide variety of consumers, needs. So some examples of differentiated products industries would be the automobile industry, smartphones, computers, soft drinks, smartphones, computers. Okay, and if you take a look at all these industries, automobiles, at least in the USA, right, there are three or four large manufacturers that sort of dominate the industry. So for automobiles in the USA, it's like either Ford, Chrysler, GMC. Those three or four manufacturers sort of dominate the industry. And for smartphones, and if you think about smartphones, the software that is used, to make smartphones, right? It can either be the Apple iOS or Google's Android phones, right? It's I don't think I at least can't think of any other ones, or at least I don't know any other type of phone softwares. For computers, it's same thing, right? Apple or Windows. So those are the two softwares that are used that dominate the industry, right? In terms of computer software. So that is the key thing with oligopolies, right? It's going to be top heavy, where a few large farms will dominate the industry. Any questions?
No.
Okay, let's move on. Then the other characteristics of oligopoly has to do with entry barriers. So there are barriers to entry in oligopoly industry. And this is how they sort of attain and retain their market control, right, through barriers to entry. So it's difficult but not impossible to enter oligopoly markets. So with perfect competition and monopolistic competition, we saw that it was really easy to enter or exit. With monopoly, it was virtually impossible. With oligopoly, it's difficult, but it's not impossible. And the most common barriers to entry in oligopoly markets include patents, resource ownership, startup cost, so brand name or loyalty, all these things. Okay, so if you are in the oligopoly industry, it's likely that the top three or four farms have at least a few of these kind of things going for them. So they probably have patents on their products, which gives them exclusive right to production and use and sell. And they have resource ownership, as we will see when we talk about the OPEC countries. They probably had to invest a lot. The high startup cost tends to be really high to enter this kind of markets. So and they have developed a brand name by being in the market early on, and being there for so many years. So for a new farm to come in and enter this market, they're going to have to overcome, if not all, at least a few of these kind of barriers. And it can be very difficult for somebody new to come in and have be able to sort of manage all of this. And so if it were fairly easy, you can understand that the market wouldn't be dominated by a few large farms. Then the last sort of characteristic that we're going to look into is this idea of mutual interdependence. Okay, so as you understand, as I mentioned, there are a few relatively large farms in this market. So what happens is, those few farms, they tend to have a great degree of market control. Right? So because there are only a few of them, so they kind of have, they all have some degree of market control, and how much market control each one has kind of also depends on their relative size. Okay. And mutual interdependence, which means that the action of one farm, it affects the others, is sort of a key feature of oligopoly. So because there are so only a few of them, and each one of them have some degree of market control, what they have to do is sort of keep a close eye on the activities of other farms. So one farm, it's not really enough to do what you're doing. You're constantly going to have to watch and see what your competitors are doing, in terms of the price they're setting, the type of product they're bringing to the market, they're introducing. So you're constantly always going to have to try and beat each other. So this is sort of this interdependence, mutual interdependence, is a key characteristic of oligopolistic farms. Because decisions made by one farm invariably affects the others, and you are also affected by the others. Okay. And you can sort of think of it like a game or a contest. So um, as you can imagine, right, in sports, for one team's success, right, depends not only on how your own team is doing, but also on how the other team is doing. If they're playing equally as well, the game might be a draw. If they underperform, it's more likely that you're going to win. So it's sort of a game in that sense that it's not enough for you to do um, well, right? It's also about what the other team is doing, how well they're doing, and keeping a close eye on that, on your competitor. Uh, that's a key issue or a key characteristic of an oligopoly. Then this idea of concentration ratio. Okay. So um, because there are a small number of large farms, right, producing a majority of the industry product, so small number of relatively large farms, right, that produce all of the output, or most of the output in the industry. Right. So what that means is that the production, right, production and sale, right, so it means how much is produced and how much is sold. These things, they tend to be concentrated in the hands of relatively few farms. Okay, the top few farms. So um, a concentration ratio is something that really lets us sort of gauge how much market share is held by a certain number of farms. Okay, so this is essentially what the concentration ratio tells us. It's the concentration ratio. The concentration ratio. It's a fraction of the total industry output, or let's call it activity. So it can be production or sale. Activity accounted by the 4 or 8 largest farms in the market. Okay, that's what the concentration ratio measures. So if I tell you this line that this oligopoly industry has a 4-farm concentration ratio of 85, it basically just means that the top 4 farms in this industry combined have 80%, 85% of the market share. Okay, so the top 4 together, they hold 85% of the market share. And if I had said, 8 farm concentration ratio of 85, it would just mean that the top 8 farms in the industry combined hold 85% of the market share. Okay, and so as you can imagine, this ratio can range from anywhere between 0% to 100%. And the closer it is to 100%, right, the more, if it's close to 100%, you are essentially a monopoly. And that would have to be like one farm, the concentration ratio, it would be a one farm concentration ratio of 100%. If that were the case, it would be a monopoly. But of course, with oligopoly, that's not going to be the case. So it can range from anywhere between 0% to 100%. And the higher the number, it just means that there is more competition in the industry. So it basically just indicates the degree of competition in an industry. So if it's a 4 farm, concentration ratio of 85, rather than 8 farm concentration ratio of 85. So of course, the 8 farm concentration ratio of 85 would mean that there is more competition in that industry compared to this 4 farm. Okay. Any question here? Is this hard to understand or difficult? There's really not much to this except, it's just a fraction, right? So it's some percentage, that is basically calculating how much market share the top 4 or 8 farms have compared to the entire industry. Okay. So then next we talk about oligopoly behavior. So oligopoly farms, can either choose to make their own individual decisions, and we call that, if they're making their decisions individually, we call that non-collusion. And then they can also do this other thing where they meet with their rivals to make industry sort of pricing decisions, and we call that collusion. Okay, so collusion and non-collusion, those are the 2 ways that an oligopoly can choose or to make their decisions. So what does collusion look like? Okay, so collusion can occur when 2 or more farms, sort of secretly agree to control price, production, or other aspects of the market. And what they're essentially doing is, when they're colluding with each other, they, like, legally they're going to remain independent and autonomous. So okay, legally they're going to be independent and autonomous, but secretly they're actually cooperating with each other. So when they do that, when they secretly cooperate with each other in terms of price, output or production, or so they can actually work like a monopoly. They can actually act as if they were one farm, which is, they become a monopoly. So by acting like a monopoly, they can set a monopoly price. They can produce a monopoly quantity, right? So remember, the monopoly price is higher than a competitive price. Monopoly quantity is lower. So by doing this, right, they can charge a higher price and they can restrict their output, by colluding and cooperating with each other and acting like one farm. They don't really have to, they're essentially cutting out the fear that, of how the other farm might, what kind of actions the other farm might take. Okay, so which is something that we're going to see with non-collusion, right? When there is non-collusion, they're constantly going to have to watch what the other is doing. But with collusion, right, they're essentially telling each other, we're not going to compete with each other. We're going to act together in cooperation, and we're going to set we're gonna work together to set a price. We're gonna work together, to set a quantity, and essentially they're gonna be a monopoly. So they're gonna make a monopoly profit, and it's gonna be, of course, inefficient for society, right? They can make monopoly profit as well, and all of this can happen with collusion. So what you should know is that explicit collusive behavior is usually illegal. So the government, tries to watch out for exclusive collusive behavior. If they ever have a suspicion that these oligopoly firms are colluding with each other, they would have severe consequences. So this is why they have to like sort of do it in secret. Okay, because um, if two farms are becoming a monopoly rather than an oligopoly, as we saw, monopoly produces not a socially optimal quantity, and they'll charge a higher price, and the government usually tries to regulate monopolies. So we don't really like monopolies unless unless we necessarily have to, right? So sometimes, if oligopolistic farms are colluding with each other, they will form something which is called a cartel, which is a group of farms that create a formal agreement not to compete with each other. Okay, and even though the collusion is illegal, especially in the U.S. It's kept a secret, but some collusive agreements are not very secretive, which is where the example of the OPEC countries coming. Does anybody know what the OPEC stands for?
No.
No. Okay, so OPEC stands for the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Okay, so this is so the OPEC is a well-known sort of cartel. It's a group of 15 countries in the world, actually. So some of these countries include like Iran, Iraq, Venezuela, Angola, Libya. Some countries in the Middle East, some countries in Africa that have very rich oil reserve. So together, these 15 countries, they own 81% of the world's known oil reserve. So that's a huge number, right? And then they produce 44% of the world's oil. So as you can see, for them to act like a to collude, right, and then sort of do it, have this formal agreement to control price, to control output, it's going to be very beneficial because they're essentially just trying to control how much oil is produced, and what the price is going to be. So it's this is well known. This is not really a secret that they do this. So they have production limits, and they have price agreements, that is this way they're trying to guard themselves against fluctuation in global economy. But of course it's not so great for, I guess, consumers, right? And then so there are certain problems with collusive behavior as well. So sometimes it can be difficult to arrive at a mutually acceptable agreement to restrict output. So if you there are 15 countries, right? If you are all trying to get to a mutually beneficial agreement, it's like you're going to produce this much, you're going to produce that much. Some countries might not like this, some countries might not like that. So it can be difficult to get to an agreement. in terms of how much you're going to produce. And also there can be cheating due to because there's really not an effective punishment mechanism. So even though you said you're going to charge this much, this price, that you're going to abide by it, and you're going to only produce this much quantity, but if you don't do that, I don't really know what the punishment is, but maybe you get kicked out of the cartel, or but there's probably not anything else like severe other than that. And then thirdly, if there are entry of new farms, right, you lose your monopoly power and your monopoly profit, and that can be problematic. If because entry is not impossible. It's difficult, but it's not impossible. Any question here?
No.
All right. Then lastly, we're going to talk about non-collusive behavior, right? So remember, we talked about two ways that an oligopoly can behave. One is through collusion, where you formally meet and secretly meet and agree on price and quantity. And the other way you can behave is through non-collusion. So here you're not um, behaving, or you're not meeting, and you don't really have any agreement with your competitor. Okay, but here you kind of have to worry about what your competitor is doing. So this is where that sort of interdependence comes in again. You always have to watch out and see how, if you take an action, what kind of counter reaction they're taking, and then you are going to have to counteract again. So it's this thing that keeps going on and on and on. So the demand curve for an oligopoly farm, for a non-collusive oligopoly farms, that's why it depends on the reactions of the rivals, and this is like part of the reason why we don't do this, in AP microeconomics, or we're not, as you have seen here, we haven't really drawn any demand supply curve. We haven't drawn anything yet. Okay, so this is, we're not going to, so we don't really do this in AP microeconomics, because it's, the demand curve looks more difficult, and I guess is beyond the scope of this class. It's a kinked demand curve. There is different slope over here, there's different slope over here. So I guess they thought it might not be appropriate for this class. So, but it's just to say that it sort of depends on the reaction of the competitor. Okay, so here, the example would be, let's say if there were two farms, farm A and farm B, right? Farm A, if they decided to raise the price for their product, okay, farm B has two choices, right? One choice is they can either raise the price for their product, right, as well, and or they can not raise the price and maintain the price as it is. Okay, so what would happen if farm A decided to raise the price and farm B decided to raise their price as well? So if they both raised their price, right, the resulting the result would be that both farm would enjoy an increase in profit, because they both did it at the same time. So they're both going to enjoy a modest increase in profits, because your revenue is going to go up, and it's great for both of them if they both do it at the same time. But let's say if farm A decided to raise their price and farm B didn't, right? They kept their original lower price. So farm B would now enjoy an increase in profit, because once again, total revenue is price times quantity. So if you lower the price for your product, right, the quantity demanded is going to increase, right? So farm B will see an increase in profits, but farm A would lose their market share, because some customers that were with farm A now is going to go to farm B, which has a differentiated product, but it's not like entirely something entirely different, right? There might be something different, but it's at least at a lower price. So some customers from farm A will now go to farm B, and then farm A would lose its market share. So two things happened, right? So two type of choices, and two different outcomes. And then the other scenario here, at scenario one, it was about farm A raising price, and how the competitor farm sort of responded or reacted to that. And then scenario two is if farm A decided to lower its prices. Okay, so then once again, farm B has two choices. They can lower their price as well. Okay, and if they both lower their price, they would both earn less profit than before. But if farm A decided to lower their price, but farm B maintained their price, right? Now farm B is going to lose their market share, while farm A is going to enjoy an increase in profit. Okay, so this is, we sort of call this thing a game. Okay, which is something that we're going to cover in our next class. So this theory, it's called a game theory, and this is, I guess, the only sort of difficult thing about oligopoly that we have to learn about this game theory. We're going to look at a table that looks like this, that looks something like this. It's a table, that shows the result for each player under different strategies. So farm A, farm B, if farm A has one strategy, if farm B takes another strategy, what are the results? And I think this is the only sort of difficult thing to wrap your head around when it comes to oligopoly. But other than that, it's all pretty straightforward. So yeah, so this is with non-collusive behavior, where you really have to watch out for your competitor and how they are reacting to your actions. Okay, so do you guys have any questions? No. Okay, so yeah, I know we're finishing a little early today, but I want to start game theory with nothing, with the next class. For next class, we're going to start game theory, and make sure to review some of these at home before you come to class, because just to try to refresh your memory. Okay.